So I want you to put yourself back into a very time and place for a minute.
Okay.
Picture the glow of a CRT televet, just lighting up a darkened living. You are a kid sitting cross-legged on the carpet.
Oh, yeah, the classic setup.
Right. And you are watching a cartoon. The narrative tension of this particular episode has been building for 20 straight minutes. The main character, this terrified little pink dog, is walking down a hallway.
Very slowly,
approaches a closed door, and the entire plot, the mystery, the emotional release of the episode, it all hinges entirely on what is waiting behind wood.
Right, the ultimate payoff.
Exactly. So he reaches out a trembling paw, he grasps the handle, he is just about to turn it, and then the screen just freezes.
It doesn't fade to black, it doesn't cut to commercial. The actual animation just stops dead.
He just stands there, frozen in time, hand on the knob. The door is never. Now, if you were a kid watching this specific episode of Courage the Cowardly Dog on Cartoon Network, which is where this bizarre fun actually happened, you would probably, smack the side of your TV.
Yeah, you'd think the cable went out or the broadcast signal dropped or something.
Right. But it wasn't a glitch. The network had intentionally frozen the frame.
And the reasoning behind that decision is what kicks off this entire analysis we're doing today.
It's wild.
It really is. Because when the international broadcast executives reviewed the footage, when they saw what the animators had actually put behind that door, they made a highly calculated decision.
Yeah.
They decided the visual was so intensely pushing the envelope, so genuinely disturbing for a children's animated block, that they could not, in good conscience, broadcast it.
They just refused.
They chose to sabotage their own episode, literally freezing the image rather than subject a young audience to the payoff.
They felt they had to actively protect children from a 2D drawing of a dog opening a door. That's wild to me.
It says a lot about the show.
It does. And it perfectly sets up what we are unpacking today. We have this massive stack of notes, essays, and retrospective analyses in front of us. And the core argument running through all of it is this radical reframing of the show.
It's a really fascinating thesis.
It is, because the argument isn't just that Courage the Cowardly Dog was a spooky cartoon that gave some 90s kids nightmares. The thesis we are exploring in this deep dive is that this show was actually an act of brilliant subconscious conditioning. It was a curriculum.
Conditioning is the precise word. If we look closely at the mechanics of the show, the pacing, the visual art styles, the audio design, the narrative structures, we start to see that it was secretly preparing an entire generation of viewers for advanced cinema.
Yeah.
It was a crash course in complex art history and deep emotional empathy, all disguised as a slapstick comedy. It was teaching its audience the structural language of the world before they even possessed the vocabulary to understand what they were looking at.
Okay, I love this premise, I really do, but I immediately have to push back just a little bit.
Sure.
It's one thing to say a show is smart or layered. It's another to say it's a masterclass in cinematic conditioning. Because to do that, you need massive reach.
You need an audience.
Right. You can't condition a generation if you're some obscure avant-garde art project playing at 3 a.m. on public access. You need a mainstream platform. So how did something this strange, this potentially disturbing, manage to infiltrate mainstream cable television in the first?
That is exactly the right question to start with, because the infiltration was incredibly strategic. To understand the Trojan horse, we really have to look at the landscape of animation in 1996.
Okay, take us back.
So Cartoon Network, at the time, had a program called What a Cartoon. It was essentially a showcase block, a place where the network could throw random, experimental, animated shorts against the wall to see what stuck.
Low stakes.
Exactly. Low stakes for the network, but high opportunity for creators. And into this block, a creator named John R. Dilworth dropped a 7-minute short film called The Chicken from Outer Space.
And this wasn't just a fun, disposable short. The critical reception was absurd.
It really was.
This bizarre little 7-minute concept featuring this dog defending an elderly couple from an alien chicken didn't just get good ratings, it was nominated for an Academy Award.
Let's pause on that for a second because the context is vital here. An Oscar nomination for Best Animated Short Film.
For a Cartoon Network short.
Right. This is an incredibly prestigious, insular category, usually dominated by high-end independent studios, or the National Film Board of Canada, or massive Disney project. And here comes an abrasive, strange, slightly unsettling short from a cable TV variety block, and it crashes the Oscars. That level of critical validation changed everything for Dilworth and the network.
It basically gave them a blank check, which explains what happens 3 years later in 1999. The short makes the leap to a full half-hour.
A huge jump.
Huge. But it wasn't just a quiet rollout. The premiere of Courage the Cowardly Dog became the highest-rated premiere in Cartoon Network's entire up to that. The hype was enormous. But, and here's the detail in our notes that completely shattered my understanding of how the show is positioned, we need to talk about the theatrical use.
The marketing strategy. Yes.
Cartoon Network didn't just run promos on their own channel. They bought theatrical preview space in actual movie theaters.
Which was expensive.
Very expensive.
Yeah.
But they didn't attach it to some edgy teen movie. They ran the previews for Courage the Cowardly Dog immediately before screenings of Pokemon, the first movie.
The absolute epicenter of safe, aggressively merchandised, universally beloved children's entertainment in 1999.
Right. I mean, you have thousands of kids sitting in theaters, clutching their Pikachu plushies, ready for the most sanitized, commercially tested anime experience of their lives.
Completely unprepared.
Totally unprepared. And right before the feature presentation, the screen goes dark, and they are subjected to a preview of a terrified, hyperventilating pink dog dealing with existential dread and alien home invasion. It's the ultimate bait and switch.
Why do you think the network executives made that specific choice, though?
To me, it feels like hiding complex, bitter vegetables inside a kid's absolute favorite bowl of mac.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
You know the mac and cheese, which is Pokemon, is going to be consumed by millions. So you sneak in this dense, advanced, challenging nutritional value right underneath it. You use the massive, safe commercial juggernaut to deliver something completely avant-garde.
That is a very apt analogy, and it highlights a crucial point about the show's production environment. The network knew Courage was going to unsettle people, but they also knew, based on the Oscar nomination and the internal testing, that the quality was undeniable.
The pedigree was there.
Exactly. Because of that massive initial commercial success-breaking premiere record, the show was granted an unusual level of protection. Dilworth treated the series as an experiment from episode to episode. The commercial success was the shield that allowed the creative anarchy to flourish.
Executors tend to look the other way when the ratings are breaking records.
They absolutely do.
So they have the audience lock. The Trojan horse is inside the game. Now we have to look at how the actual curriculum like, how do you take a kid who tuned in hoping for a standard goofy cartoon and start teaching them advanced genre?
It's quite the pivot.
It is, and according to the analysis we are looking at, it starts by completely dismantling the standard rules of children's television and replacing them with the foundational rules of cinematic horror.
Well, if we are going to talk about horror, we first need to define what horror actually is structurally, because a lot of people confuse horror with action or thriller.
Right, there's a big difference.
A huge difference.
Yeah.
The defining rule of true horror, whether it's literature or film, is the relationship the protagonist has with fear. If the protagonist is fearless, if they are stoic and capable and unafraid of the monster, you are not watching a horror movie. You are watching an action.
Right, like if Arnold Schwarzenegger is fighting the Predator, he might be outmatched, but he's not having a panic attack.
No, he's building traps.
He's getting ready. That's an act.
Exactly. In horror, the protagonist must be vulnerable. They are simply the person who manages to survive the fear. And this is where the character of Courage becomes the perfect surrogate for a child.
Because kids are inherently vulnerable?
Precise. Think about the psychology of a young kid. The world is massive, unpredictable, largely unexplained, and inherently terrifying.
Yeah.
A child is constantly encountering things they don't understand, which is the root of anxiety.
Yeah.
Courage didn't just experience fear, he embodied it physically. His teeth chattered, he screamed, he literally fell to pieces.
He validated the feeling of being terrified.
Yes, he wasn't brave because he lacked fear. He was brave because he was absolutely paralyzed by terror, but he pushed through the hallway anyway to save his family. That is the foundational lesson of the horror genre, that bravery is action in the face of overwhelming fear.
But the creators were smart. They knew you can't just subject a kid to 22 uninterrupted minutes of psychological dread.
They would tune out.
The child will just turn the channel or leave the room. So they utilized a highly advanced pacing technique. The pacing of Courage is fascinating because of the tonal whiplash.
It's extreme.
Very extreme. They would give you a classic physical comedy bit something straight out of Looney Tunes, an anvil falling, a goofy sound effect. Your defenses completely drop. You are relaxed. You are laughing. And then the span of a single frame, the tone violently shifts into severe drama or intense dread.
This is a technique you usually see in prestige cinema. Directors like Bong Joon-ho or the Coen brothers are famous moving the audience from laughter to shock so quickly that the brain doesn't have time to process the transition, which actually heightens the emotional impact of the scare.
Because you aren't braced for it.
Exactly. The fact that a children's cartoon was utilizing this kind of emotional manipulation is impressive. But what's even more impressive is the specific curriculum of subgenres they were introduced.
This is where the notes really get incredible. They weren't just doing generic spooky ghosts and skeletons Halloween stuff. They were methodically introducing the audience to highly specific, categorized horror subgenres.
Let's start with psychological and behavioral horror.
Okay, yeah. There is a character that every single person who watched the show remembers, in a character named Freaky Fred.
Oh, man. Just the mention of the name usually elicits a reaction.
Absolutely. Because Freaky Fred wasn't a monster. He didn't have fangs or claws. He was Eustace's nephew. He was a polite, soft-spoken, smiling man who spoke almost entirely in rhyming poetry.
Which is unsettling on its own.
Very. But he had a pathological, uncontrollable compulsion to shave. Now, on paper, that sounds like a joke, a guy who wants to shave the dog, haha. But the execution was terrifying. And our analysis points out why. It's because this episode was teaching the audience that horror doesn't have to be external. It can be social. It can be a behavioral pathology.
It's the terror of the uncanny valley applied to human psychology.
Yeah.
Fred looks human. He acts mostly human, but something in his psychological makeup is deeply broken, and you were trapped in a bathroom with him.
Right. The feeling of being cornered by someone whose mind does not work the way yours does, and the analysis makes a direct structural comparison.
It's a very clear homage.
It is. The Freaky Fred episode operates as a direct, undeniable parody of the Muse Todd. The demon barber of Fleet Street mixed with the psychological profiling and intense, quiet close-ups of the silence of the lamb.
Think about the implications of that for a sec. You have an audience of 8, 9, 10-year-olds. They are absorbing the narrative beat, the claustrophobia, and the specific psychological tension of the Silence of the Lambs.
Without even knowing it.
Exactly. They are learning how a psychopath operates in a cinematic narrative years before they will ever hear the name Hannibal Lecter.
And once they mastered the psychological, they move straight to goal. Let's talk about body horror. Now, when I think of body horror, I think of R-rated Midnight Madness.
Sure, lots of gore.
Right. But Courage did an episode called The Clutching Foot. Eustace gets a fungus on his standard cartoon trope. Except the fungus grows. It becomes massive, pulsating, and eventually sentient. It develops a face, a personality, and it completely consumes Eustace, taking over his entire body and holding the family hostage.
Body horror is a very specific subgenre that preys on a very primal fear. It's the betrayal of your own flesh. It's the fear of disease, of losing autonomy over your physical form, of your body becoming alien to you. The undisputed master of this in cinema is David Cronenberg, with films like The Fly or Videodrome. And this episode is a textbook execution of Cronenberg's philosophy. It's grotesque, it's visceral, and it forces the viewer to confront the fragility of the human body.
But wait, I have to jump in here. If I'm a parent in 1999 and I realize my kid is watching a Cronenberg-style body horror narrative disguised as a cartoon, I'm probably turning the TV off. What is the actual value of exposing a child to that? Isn't it just giving them a phobia of athlete's foot?
It's a fair critique, absolutely, but the value lies in cinematic literacy. By introducing these specific, intense concepts in a controlled, animated environment, the show is creating a subconscious framework. It is inoculating the viewer.
Like a vaccine.
Exactly like a vaccine. When that child grows up and eventually watches The Fly or The Thing, their brain doesn't completely reject the imagery as incomprehensible trauma. They have a file folder for it already.
Right. They've seen the shape of the story before.
The cartoon taught them how to process that specific category of tension. They understand the rules of the genre because a pink dog already walked them through it.
Okay, I see that. It's building the scaffolding before they have to lift the heavy. And they did this with paranormal horror, too. There's a sequence in the show that is an unapologetic, frame-for-frame parody of The Exorcist.
Oh, it's so blatant.
We are talking the spinning head, pea suit, the levitating bed. They took the most infamous, boundary-pushing horror film of the 1970s and mapped its visual language directly onto a cartoon.
Which perfectly transitions us to the next massive pillar of this analysis. We've talked about how they hijacked cinematic narrative structures, but the conditioning goes so much deeper than just the stories they were telling.
It's about how it looked.
Exactly. The show completely subverted the visual expectations of what a cartoon is supposed to look like. It operated as a crash course in fine art history.
Yeah. This is the part of the deep dive that really blew my mind because it explains so much about why the show felt so deeply uncomfortable to watch.
It really did.
To understand that, we have to talk about a concept our research refers to as visuals. Can you unpack what visual security actually means in the context of it?
Certainly. When you watch a standard animated show, let's say The Simpsons or SpongeBob SquarePants, the creators establish a rigid set of visuals. The characters always have the same proportion, the color palette is consistent, the laws of physics, however exaggerated, remain reliable within that universe.
Things don't just randomly change styles.
No, they don't. This consistency is intentional. It lulls the viewer into a state of visual security. You know what the world looks like, so your your brain relax. You feel safe in the environment.
You don't have to constantly assess whether the sky is going to suddenly turn into static. You trust.
Precisely. You trust the reality of the medium. But Courage actively weaponized that trust. It took visual security and completely shattered it, specifically to induce a sense of profound discomfort.
They were so good at that.
They really were. The creators utilized mixed media long before it was a trendy stylistic choice in animation. You would be watching a scene rendered in standard, flat 2D animation, and then, with zero warning, the perspective would shift. You'd be confronted with a hyper-realistic 3D CGI rendering, or a character made entirely out of stop-motion claymation, or highly textured, jarring paper cutouts.
The most famous example, of course, is the spirit of King Ramses, the man in gauze.
Return the slab.
Yes. You have this flat 2D desert environment, and suddenly there is a blurry 3D rendered photorealistic figure standing in the distance, moving at a completely different frame rate than the rest of the show. It is a stylistic whip.
And we have to ask why that is so unnerving. Why does a change in art style scare us?
Right. Why does it work?
It's because it breaks the established reality. When a new medium is introduced, it tells the subconscious mind of the viewer, the rules of physics here are broken. The very fabric of this universe is unstable, and therefore you are not safe.
I was thinking about this a lot last night while reading the note. When a show breaks its own visual rules like that, is it possible that the structural breaking is actually scarier than whatever monster is on screen?
Oh, absolutely.
Because if a monster chases you, that's a narrative problem. Courage can run away from a monster. But if the actual medium of the world changes, like if the 2D universe is suddenly invaded by a 3D object, that implies the creator of the universe has lost control. The threat isn't just a bad guy. The threat is existential. It's reality itself falling apart.
That is a phenomenal insight, and it hits the absolute core of the show's psychological impact. A monster is a defined threat. An existential breakdown of reality is an undefined threat, and undefined threats are infinitely more terrifying.
Because you can't fight them.
You can't. But the show didn't just break the rules randomly. It didn't just throw 3D in for the sake of being weird. The analysis shows they were actively introducing recognized historical fine art movement.
Let's look at the movement of our notes highlight an episode called The Sandman. This episode didn't just have weird visual, it directly incorporated the visual language Salvador Dali and René Magritte.
Right. If you think about Dali's The Persistence of Memory, the melting clocks, or Magritte's use of impossible juxtapositions like a train coming out of a fire, Surrealism is built on dream logic. It takes recognizable objects and removes their rational content. It forces the brain to try and make sense of something that inherently defies.
And Courage was doing exactly that. They were rendering melting landscapes, impossible geometry, objects behaving in ways that defied gravity and logic. They were literally installing the cognitive architecture of surrealism into the minds of children who didn't even know the word yet.
That's a foundational art class.
It really is. But they didn't stop there. They moved on to an arguably even darker, more influential movement, which is German Expressionism.
This is where the cinematic literacy reaches graduate level.
German Expressionism in a cartoon dog show. It sounds absurd, but the parallels are undeniable. There's an episode titled The Shadow of Courage. Can you explain the core philosophy of German Expressionism and how it was applied?
German Expressionism emerged in film and art primarily after World War I. The core tenet is the externalization of internal emotion.
Okay, what?
Instead of having a character just say they are sad or afraid, the artist makes the physical world look like fear. The architecture becomes harsh, jagged, and aggressively unnatural. The lighting is characterized by extreme high contrast, deep impenetrable blacks, and harsh, blinding white. The shadows don't necessarily behave according to the light source. They loom, they stretch, they act as their own entities.
It's the visual representation of anxiety and isolation. And the analysis directly compares the visual cues in The Shadow of Courage to the legendary 1922 silent film Nosferatu.
A masterpiece of the genre.
Yeah. If you look at the way the shadows crawl up the walls of the farmhouse, the exaggerated angles of the staircases, the overwhelming sense of vulnerability, it is a direct homage. The animators were using early 20th century European film tech to make you feel isolated in a 1990s cartoon.
And it wasn't just cinematic movements. The foundational setting of the show itself, like the very ground Courage walks on, is rooted in classic American fine art.
This was my favorite detail from the entire stack, the physical set. Eustace and Muriel live in a dilapidated farmhouse in a place literally called Nowhere.
Nowhere, Kansas, I believe.
Yeah, nowhere. It's just a house surrounded by a barren, infinite expanse of dirt. It's incredibly desolate. But it's not just a generic background. It is fundamentally modeled after two of the most famous American paintings of the 20th century.
The first being Andrew Wyeth's 1948 masterpiece, Christina's.
If you've ever been to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, you've liked it. It's a painting of a young woman lying in a vast, barren, tawny field looking up at a gray, solitary house on the distant horizon.
It's a very striking image.
Very striking. The feeling that painting evokes is one of profound distance, yearning, and quiet. The landscape and courage, the color palette of the dirt, the solitary placement of the farmhouse is a near identical record.
By using that specific visual language, the animators immediately instill a sense of isolation in the viewer before a single line of dialogue is spoken. You look at that house, and you instantly understand no one is coming to help. They are entirely cut off from the world.
They're on their own.
Exactly. And the second inspiration further cements the tone.
Grant Wood's American Gothic, the pitchfork, the austere farmer, the daughter beside, the quintessential image of unyielding, severe American stoicism.
Everyone knows that paint.
Everyone. And the characters of Eustace and Muriel are heavily, heavily inspired by Eustace's rigid, angry resistance to the outside world, pure American Gothic. There's even a sequence in the show where they literally insert the farmhouse directly into the background of the actual painting.
So if we synthesize this, we have a show that is utilizing Dali's dream logic, Nosferatu's anxiety-inducing lighting, and Andrew Wyeth's profound isolation. It is a masterclass in visual manipulation.
So they've destabilized the audience's eyes. They've broken visual security. But the analysis makes it clear that they weren't finished, because to truly execute this level of tension, they had to attack the other prime. They had to destabilize the audience.
The soundscape.
The soundscape of
the audio design of Courage is arguably more radical than its visual design, and it starts with the rejection of the standard animated score. They didn't rely on the upbeat, bouncy synthesizers or the comical slide whistles you'd expect. They elevated the audio by utilizing heavy, dramatic, classical music.
The prime example being the recurring use of Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyrie. Now imagine you are a 9. You are watching a cartoon dog run from a giant chicken, but the music underneath it is a sweeping, apocalyptic, high-art symphonic mass.
It's so intense.
It is. For a huge portion of that young audience, this was their very first exposure to classical music in any kind of dramatic context. They were being taught to associate symphonic music with intense narrative.
It adds an unearned massive weight to the proceeding. But the real genius of the audio and the most fascinating behind-the-scenes detail in the research comes from the creator, John R. Dilworth, and his philosophy regarding sound effect. Dilworth had one strict, unbreakable rule for his audio department: absolutely no stock sound.
Which, from a production standpoint, is absolute madness.
It's unheard of in television anime.
Completely unheard of. The entire animation industry runs on stock sounds. You have the Wilhelm scream, the Hanna-Barbera running bongos, the slipping on a banana peel noise. Studios use them because they're instantly recognizable to the audience, and more importantly, they save a massive amount of time and money. Sound design from scratch, incredible.
But Dilworth refused the industry standard. He demanded custom audio for nearly everything. But he didn't just ask his team to make scary noises. The metric he used to approve a new sound effect is what truly sets the show apart.
This is the best.
His philosophy was simply this: he would only approve a sound effect if playing it back made him laugh in the editing room.
I stared at that note for a long time. It sounds completely counterintuitive. You are making a show heavily influenced by The Exorcist and German Expressionism. Your goal is to build tension. Why on earth is your metric for sound design whether or not it makes you chuckle? How does a funny noise create horror?
This is where we get into the psychology of cognitive dissonance. Why does laughing at a sound effect create horror in context? Because the tone becomes entirely unfamiliar.
Okay, give me an example.
Let's say a terrifying, grotesque monster is approaching the farmhouse. The visual language tells you to be afraid, but when the monster opens its mouth, the sound that comes out isn't a deep cinematic roar. It's a strange, squelching, almost kazoo-like noise that is inherently ridiculous.
It breaks your brain for a second.
Exactly. You experience cognitive dissonance. Your brain is receiving conflicting signals. Your eyes say terror. Your ears say comedy. And in that moment of confusion, you don't know how to react.
The show refuses to tell you how to feel.
That is the brilliant mechanism. It doesn't give you the heavy musical sting that cues you to be scared, and it doesn't give you the laugh track or the slide whistle that cues you to laugh. It presents a bizarre, contradictory audio-visual combination and just steps back.
It leaves you hanging.
It forces the viewer to actively participate and decide for themselves if the moment is terrifying or hilarious. Often, it's both.
And the research essay makes a very sharp observation here, contrasting Courage with modern media. It argues that this level of ambiguity is incredibly rare today. Modern animation, and honestly a lot of modern live-action blockbusters, struggle to trust their audience.
They hold your hand.
They really do.
Mm-hmm.
They dictate exactly what you're supposed to feel at every given microsecond. The music swells exactly when you should cry. The bass drops exactly. Courage just threw you into the deep end of the tonal pool. You're out.
It respected the intelligence of its audience. It assumed children were capable of holding two contradictory emotions, fear and amusement, at the exact same time. And that respect is a key component of why the show's impact has endured for decades.
But, hearing us talk about it, all this deep dive into body horror, existential dread, reality-breaking visuals, and cognitive dissonance could very easily sound like we are describing a deeply cynical, mean-spirited show.
It sounds a bit traumatic.
Right. It sounds like an exercise in traumatizing kids for sport.
Yeah.
But if you actually watch the show, that isn't the vibe at all. It never feels cruel. And that brings us to a major pivot in our... We have to explore the show's secret weapon, element that anchored mad, profound emotional horror.
Because if it lacked that emotional core, it would just be nihilistic cruelty. But the show was actually deeply subversive in how it handled its own darkness. It used the language of horror not to preach despair, but to teach empathy.
The deep dive uses a specific episode to perfectly illustrate this, an episode frequently cited as one of the best half hours of animated television ever produced. It's called The Hunchback of Nowhere.
Let's break down the narrative structure here, because the setup is pure, classic, gothic horror.
It hits all the tropes.
Every single one. You have a hunchback figure wrapped in a cloak wandering through a violently stormy, desolate landscape.
Yeah.
He's seeking shelter, he approaches various homes, and everywhere he goes, he is immediately turned away. The people he encounters are terrified of his physical deformity.
It is the textbook setup for a Frankenstein-style monster story. The audience is primed by a century of pop culture to view this deformed outcast as a threat. Right. The visual cues tell us he is the monster. But then he arrives at the farmhouse. Eustace, true to form, is incredibly cruel to him and refuses him shelter. The hunchback retreats to the barn.
This is the turning.
Courage, our cowardly, perpetually terrified protagonist, goes to the barn. He discovers that this towering, physically imposing figure isn't scary at all. In fact, the hunchback is deeply sensitive, and he is afraid of the casual, everyday, cruel, normal humans.
Which completely inverts the dynamic. The human being Eustace is revealed to be the true monster, and the visually terrifying monster is revealed to be the victim.
And the resolution of this episode is what solidifies the show's philosophy. Courage doesn't defeat the hunchback with violence. He doesn't build a trap or find a weapon. Instead, he befriends him.
He plays music.
Yeah, and together, they find a way to teach Eustace what it feels like to be the outcast. They turn the tables, making Eustace experience the vulnerability he inflicted on others. The narrative conflict is resolved entirely through empathy.
And if we step back and look at the macro structure of the entire series, this was not an isolated incident. The broader thesis here is that in the world of Courage the Cowardly Dog, monsters are very rarely inherently evil. The ghosts, the aliens, the bizarre creatures, they are almost always simply misunderstood and
they just need help.
Right. They are beings experiencing a problem or acting out of a past trauma. And those problems are almost universally solved through empathy, communication, and understanding rather than through combat.
It's amazing. The show spends half its runtime building up these terrifying horror tropes and then uses the second half to completely subvert them. It acts as the ultimate emotional buffer. The research argues that this recurring theme, that the scary thing just needs a hug or a favor, is what stops Courage from sinking into pure dark. It provides a safety net under the gothic elements.
It's a very reassuring message.
It makes me think of the most classic childhood, the monster in the closet. You're lying in bed, the lights are off, and you're terrified of whatever is hiding behind that closet door waiting to get...
We've all been there.
Exactly. The way Courage reframes horror, it's like, what if you finally muster the bravery to open the closet door and you find the monster, but the monster's crying? What if it's only hiding in the dark because the real world outside is too mean to... It completely rewires how a kid looks at the unknown.
That is a phenomenal analogy. It teaches the audience that the unknown is not inherently malicious, it is merely unknown. Fear is an appropriate initial response, but the ultimate solution requires compassion, not violence. It's an incredibly mature lesson hidden inside a cartoon.
So we have mapped out how the machine works. The Trojan horse, the visual anarchy, the sound design, the horror genres, and the core of empathy. But we have to ask about the legacy. What was the ultimate result of feeding this high-concept, context-free media to a massive generation of young people in the late 90s and early 2000s?
And how did the industry react later?
Right, and looking back, how did the television industry eventually repay that creative brilliance?
To understand the legacy, we have to look at the long-term effects of this conditioning and, unfortunately, the rather ironic, bitter fate of the show itself.
The research comes back to this phrase that I can't stop thinking about. Parody without context. It is such a powerful concept, and it uses a specific character to prove the point. Benton Tarantella.
Ah, the zombie movie director who resurrects people to star in his snuff films?
Yes. Now, looking back at it today, the character of Benton Tarantella is an incredibly obvious, completely on-the-nose play on the real-life director Quentin.
Right down to the chin in the dialogue.
The mannerisms, the dialogue, the obsession with specific cinematic framing. But the analysis points out the absolute staggering absurdity of including. Think about the timeline. When this episode of Courage aired, Quentin Tarantino was not the elder statesman of cinema he is today. He had only directed 3 feature films: Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, and Jackie Brown.
3 highly violent, vanity-laced, R-rated, dialogue-heavy, independent films that were strictly for adults.
Exactly. The primary demographic of Cartoon Network had a 0% chance of understanding that reference. They didn't know who Tarantino was. They obviously hadn't seen it. They didn't know his cinematic tropes. It was a parody entirely, completely devoid of context for the viewer.
But that lack of context is exactly the point the analysis is driving at. The show wasn't expecting an 8-year-old in 1999 to get a Reservoir Dogs joke. It wasn't about instant gratification. It was acting as a vehicle for foundational exposure. It was planting intellectual seeds.
It was literally preparing you for the future.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The core argument of the brainwashing thesis concludes right here. The idea is that later in life, when these young viewers finally hit their late teens or 20s and they encountered actual body horror, or they studied German Expressionism in a college art history class, or they finally sat down to watch Pulp Fiction, they were already subconsciously receptive to the material.
It wasn't alien to them.
No, they didn't reject these weird, complex, abrasive ideas because a strange, pink cartoon dog had already spent years challenging their brains to be open to absolutely anything. They possessed the framework to appreciate complex art because Courage built the foundation.
It is genuinely beautiful when you frame it like that. A children's show is secretly acting as a rigorous ambassador to the wider, weirder world of global art and cinema. But as with a lot of brilliant art, the story doesn't end on a triumphant, celebratory note.
Unfortunately not.
Our deep dive has to address the rather bitter irony of the show's fate, specifically looking at the revival attempt that happened around 20.
Right. Given the massive cultural footprint, the enduring legacy, and the critical reappraisal of the show, you would logically expect networks to be eager to revisit the property. Nostalgia is a powerful.
And for a brief moment, it seemed like they were going to. The research shares this incredibly bittersweet ending to the Courage saga. Around 2018, there were concrete public statements that a prequel series to Courage was actively in development. John R. Dilworth, the original creator, was on board and worked. Fan was ecstatic.
But the landscape of television, and specifically the corporate structure of animation, had changed significantly since 1999. The shield that originally protected Dilworth was gone.
It was entirely gone. And the analysis details how eventually the executives at Cartoon Network shifted their focus. They dragged their feet and eventually decided to move on entirely. Using the metaphor from the very beginning of our deep dive, the censored doorway in the Asian broadcast, the modern executives simply refused to open the door to see what Dilworth could imagine next.
They chose the frozen frame.
Yes, they did. They chose not to see it. And the notes confirm that an animatic pilot, just a rough, unpolished animated storyboard titled Goblins of Litter, is all the world will ever see of this prequel. That rough sketch is the final period on the sentence.
The profound irony of that out cannot be over. Think about what we've discussed. We were talking about a television show that was built from the ground up on taking massive risk. It took every single artistic, narrative, visual, and auditory risk imaginable.
It never played it.
Never. It challenged its audience constantly. And ultimately, it died because network executives in the modern, data-driven era refused to take a risk on it. They wanted the safe, the predictable, the visually secure. The environment that allowed Courage to exist in 1999 simply does not exist in the same way today.
It's a tragedy. A show that spent its entire run teaching a generation of kids how to face the unknown was ultimately killed by an industry that has become utterly terrified of the unknown. And that thought brings us to the final takeaway from the essay we've been analyzing ends with a plea to the viewer, and it's something I want to pass directly on.
It serves as a powerful summation of the show's entire.
The source material leaves us be like courage. No matter what it is you are doing in your life, no matter what hallway you are walking, open the door. It might be scary. It will probably be uncomfortable, but whatever is waiting on the other side of that door has the chance to be well worth it.
It's fundamentally about embracing the unknown rather than freezing in front of it and retreating into safety.
Exactly. But looking at everything we've unpacked today, it leaves me with a final, lingering, a provocative question that builds on the leg of the show. We established today that courage worked so brilliantly because it forced exposure.
Yes, the preemptive brainwash.
It subjected audiences to things they weren't actively looking for. It was that parody without context. It was the accidental, unavoidable discovery of surrealism and classical music while you were just sitting there waiting for Pokemon to start.
It was friction. The media challenged the viewer.
Right, but look at the media landscape you and I live in today. We live in a world governed entirely by algorithms that are designed to perfectly tailor and curate every single piece of content to exactly what we already know we like.
It's an echo chamber.
If you watch a show about baking, your feed is instantly flooded with 20 more shows about. The visual security is absolute. The tonal security is absolute. The algorithm's entire purpose is to remove friction.
The algorithm is designed to eliminate the unexpected, because the unexpected might make you click away.
So my question for you, the listeners, in a world perfectly, seamlessly curated to our existing comforts and bias, where is the next generation going to get that accidental, scary, beautiful exposure to the unknown? If the algorithms only ever give us exactly what we want, who is going to force us to open?
It's a critical question we all need to be asking ourselves about the media we consume, the media we share, the media we allow to shape our perspective.
Thank you so much for joining us on The Dive, where we appreciate time or depth. I hope you take of that get